Welcome back to the Mountain Morning Show. The book is Supreme Power. The author is Judge Ted Stewart. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you,
It's great
Joe.
to have you here.
Thank you.
Federal court judge.
Yes.
Who should certainly know an awful lot about the Supreme Court, which is what this book is all about. And you take a look in this book at the consequences of Supreme Court's decisions. Is that the basic premise?
I think that's a good summary. I wrote the book because I think the people in the United States would be amazed at how much the America we live in today has been shaped by Supreme Court decision in contrast to legislation and a presidency.
Indeed. Well, Your Honor, we're going to get right into that because I've got a lot of questions for you, especially the impact that we may have with new justices being appointed, as that's certainly going to change the landscape more. But let's look back for a moment. Tell me what, you mentioned 7 pivotal decisions. What are those 7?
I begin with Marbury versus Madison, which was the case that in 1803, in effect, vested in the Supreme Court the power of judicial review, which really was responsible for all the other decisions. I then look at the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which, if you were to look at the state of race relations in the United States today, which are inflamed, I think everyone would have to agree. I attribute them to that decision in 1896, where the Supreme Court sanctioned state-sponsored segregation. Separate but equal. And had it not been for that, we may very well be in an America where race relations were very different than they are today. I look at the case of Lochner versus New York, which was a simple case about the right of bakers to employ their bakery workers for longer hours.
Right.
But it was the birth of a power taken upon itself by the Supreme Court to define what liberty means. And it is then the genesis for the Roe versus Wade abortion case, the Obergefell decision on same-sex marriage, and so on. Perhaps one of the most important cases is Wickard. It's a case involving an Ohio farmer who wanted to grow more wheat than the federal government thought he should. And it resulted in the Supreme Court redefining what interstate commerce was, and it resulted in the federal government taking upon itself an incredible amount of power that it did not have before that. It gave to the Congress and the President a way to satisfy their insatiable desire for power.
Indeed.
And thus they have such great influence over us today. I look at the case of Everson, which is the case where the United States Supreme Court came upon the notion that the religion and government should be separate. I look at a case in Jenkins versus Missouri, where a federal judge in the 1990s expended $2 billion to try to desegregate the Kansas City School District. But in the course of that, the Supreme Court said that a federal judge had the authority to raise taxes, to order the raising of taxes. And finally, I look at the Obergefell decision, which in context was not the focus. It really was a chapter where I try to point out that much of what we have by way of our culture, our morality in America today, has been affected by Supreme Court decision.
Indeed. You have obviously spent a considerable amount of time in research, and as a senior judge, I presume that you have watched over time a lot of empire building, and it seems that an awful lot of what you just discussed right there was a tremendous amount of empire building of the Supreme Court itself, and in maybe indirect, but it seems very direct to me, power for other offices. What do you think about that? When you look back at that and see how the landscape has changed, does that give you a pause? Does it give you a moment to pause? What do you think?
It does, Joe, and that is a very thoughtful question, because it points out, in the case of the Wickard, the Ohio farmer, it really did open the door to a tremendous expansion of federal power versus that of the states. As a result, the federalism which was intended by the founders, where you'd have a federal government that was checked to some extent by the state governments, that has been eroded tremendously. And again, it was not the court who initiated it. They were simply responding to looking at legislation passed in the 1930s. But they opened the door, and the federal government ran into it.
And they have a choice as to whether or not to review a case like that, right? They could have sent it back, and it may have made a much different it would have created a different world than we're in.
Or they could have issued a ruling which severely limited the power of the federal government. But they did not. Your other observation is very astute, and that is they have taken upon themselves, that is the Supreme Court, this responsibility of defining what liberty is. And you may think, well, that's logical, but
it wasn't the plan.
It wasn't the plan, exactly, Joe. It was, you know, the discussion over the judiciary in the framing, of the Constitution was very interesting. Those who opposed the Constitution, those that were referred to as the anti-federalists, their greatest fear was the judiciary. They saw a Supreme Court, as independent as it was created, as a real threat to the liberty of Americans. Those who supported the Constitution, and in particular Alexander Hamilton, said no, as long as judges simply exercise judgment and do not impose their will, that's what is intended, and we're going to be fine.
But that's a slippery slope.
It is a slippery slope, and I think, excuse me, it is my argument that more and more the courts, but the Supreme Court in particular, has exercised its will on the American experiment in self-government and has gone far afield, in many cases, from simply exercising judgment.
And at this point, I suppose the real question that begs is can it ever be reined back in? And one would have to argue it would be pretty difficult at this point.
It's going to be reined in, if at all, in one of two ways. Number one, in the appointments that are made by the President and confirmed by the Senate. And secondly, if the judges of the United States, and in particular the members of the Supreme Court, adapt a certain humility that is not necessarily possessed by a majority of them today. In the Obergefell decision, Justice Scalia made the observation that he didn't really much care about the decision itself, what the marriage laws of the United States were, but he did care about who ruled over him. And he then went on to say, this decision today tells me that the 320 million Americans are in fact ruled by 5 members of the 9-member Supreme Court. You know, I think it was Justice Alito who made the observation, Chief Justice Roberts, who made the observation that judicial humility was lacking in this decision, and that it was a legitimate threat to self-government in the United States. So many of the opinions that I express in the book, opinions that are of a concern, are simply those that I echo from many other judges and justices.
That brings an interesting point, and that is, it seems when we look at our justices, we all, maybe out of respect, right out of the gate, assume that they know better than we do in some sense, or that that they should have, as you mentioned, you kind of talked about this, that they should have these powers that they've granted upon themselves. And it never occurs to me when I look at some of these judges, because they don't exactly seem like power-wielding crazies. They seem to be thoughtful and hopefully logical. But it seems from what you're saying that in some cases there was a lot of desire to make a power grab at some point among some of them. Is that an accurate statement?
I think that, as is the case in many instances, Joe, they are entirely pure in their motives. Mm-hmm. They are doing what they think is right for America. I honestly don't doubt that. I don't think that has ever been the motivation that you attribute or suggested that they perhaps have, a power grab.
So maybe it's unintended consequences?
It's unintended consequences. But more importantly, I think that they have decided that the end justifies the means, that accomplishing what they deem to be a great good for America would justify perhaps the exercise of judicial power that they otherwise would not feel comfortable with themselves. That's true, I think, of many elected officials. So again, I don't suggest that the 5 members in the Supreme Court who have made a number of the decisions that I talk about in the book ever did so out of purely personal motives or malice or simply to acquire power. They did what they thought was right. But the fact is that we have an America today which is shaped more and more by judges and justices who are not accountable to the American people and whose decisions are of long duration. You know, we have presidents come and go.
Right.
We have Congresses come and go. But once the Supreme Court makes a constitutional interpretation, that interpretation and its effects and impacts on America remains until either the Constitution is amended, which doesn't happen, or the Supreme Court reverses itself, which doesn't happen very often. And that, the long-lasting effect of the Supreme Court decisions is what I think makes what they do so very, very important, and why they have in fact impacted America as they have.
Well, I'm interested to continue the conversation. I want to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the fact that, of course, the court reconvenes relatively soon, and we'll need to talk about some of the things that they're facing. But also, I want to talk a little bit about you as a judge as well, and hear about some of your decisions, if that's all right.
Okay.
So we'll talk about that when we come back right here on the Mountain Morning Show. Welcome back to the Mountain Morning Show. We continue our conversation with Judge Ted Stewart. He's the author of Supreme Power, and again, 7 pivotal Supreme Court decisions that have a major impact on America, and that is certain, there is no doubt. But there are more decisions to come. As the court reconvenes, some of them, and we've over the last couple of years, there have been some amazingly difficult ones. Talk about some of the things that you see as intriguing and maybe have some unintended consequences coming in this next session.
I think most are already pretty much clear to those who pay attention to the Supreme Court. Number one, the Trump travel ban is going to be argued, I think, very early on in the October term, and that has some significance because the question is, you know, what influence should the courts have in international affairs versus that of the president. Perhaps one that's very interesting to anyone who is a political junkie is a question of gerrymandering, political gerrymandering. And
I couldn't agree more. This one is right to the heart of where we sit politically in that landscape now, as far as who our leaders are.
Right. And it's interesting because it was the Supreme Court in a Baker decision in the 1970s who completely refigured the makeup of state legislatures across the country when they said that they had to have equal populations, which was not the historical fact.
Right.
And it broke down a barrier where the Supreme Court previous to that had said, well, there's certain decisions that are political, and we don't get into that. Once the Baker decision, they have been involved in many political decisions, and the question of the appropriateness of political gerrymandering is one of them. They will be talking about a very important case on the limits of religious liberty involving a baker in Colorado. They'll be talking about the right of law enforcement to access cell phone records. They'll be talking about, or deciding, excuse me, not talking about, but deciding cases on the limits of immigration enforcement.
Right.
So the agenda is full already of very many cases, and every one of these will in one way or another impact the way you and I live in America.
So they all interest you. You're interested in seeing every one of these judgments.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Wow. And it will be a busy time for them, certainly. You have a busy time in the federal court as well, making these types of some very important and difficult decisions. When you look back to your career, is there anything that stands out specifically?
Well, I had a case assigned to me very early on involving the question of the ownership of the Salt Lake Tribune. Long case, lasted years. I think at the end of it, the amount of money spent on the attorneys in the case was in the $30 or $40 million.
Right.
And some have said it was the most expensive case in terms of dollars spent on attorneys of any case in Utah history. I think some of the interesting cases are the criminal cases that most people would never know about. I had one case involving a group of men who had somehow or another acquired several $100,000 in U.S. savings bond when they robbed a small home in Sparks, Nevada. They tried to figure out a way to change these U.S. savings bonds into cash. They found someone in Chicago who said they can do it. They got on a train in Sacramento and they started smoking marijuana and they started harassing the women, so they got kicked off the train in Helper, and the local authorities were notified that there was some guys smoking marijuana, that they were getting kicked off the train, and thus were discovered several $100,000 in U.S. savings bonds, and so they ended up in front of me. So
Wow.
yeah, there are multiple cases we could talk about, Joe, but yes.
Indeed. Well, obviously some very fascinating cases here in the book, and this book. Tell me where this is available. Where can we find it? First of all.
Its official release date is Tuesday, the 26th of September. It will be available in the Deseret bookstores, but also on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, just about any place you can buy a book.
Okay. Well, we're definitely looking forward to reading it. I think a lot of people should. You've got the foreword by Congressman Chris Stewart. Are you related in some way?
Oh, we're brothers.
Is that right? I
Yes.
didn't know.
Yes.
That's fascinating.
Yes.
I have quite a fondness for Senator Stewart, Congressman Stewart. He's quite a man.
Well, he's
Military, a fellow Air Force.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, as an older brother, I'll take credit for any good in his life. All right.
And apparently he's taking a little credit too
that's
by
right.
providing a foreword for you. That's
Yes,
great.
yes.
Well, in closing, if I could ask you to say hi to my friend Judge Sam and also to Judge Jenkins, I'd certainly appreciate
I will do
that.
Their offices are on either side of mine in the federal courthouse, so that will be very easy to do.
Well, I certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much for joining us. This is fascinating. I think we might need to bring you back to talk about some of the things that are coming, if you don't mind. Maybe you could give a little analysis.
I would be delighted, Joe.
I'd like that very much.
All right.
So you'll definitely want to stay tuned to that here on the Mountain Morning Show as we get a chance to talk with Judge Stewart again, hopefully to discuss what comes with the Supreme Court. We'll end now with a quick commercial break, come back and wrap up the show right after this.